Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's live stream presentation. My name is John. I am the tattooed historian, and I'm happy to say that I went today to get a haircut because I couldn't compete with my co-host, the great Pete Carmichael, director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. How are you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great. Thank you, John. My wife today came home and informed me that I don't go to a barber, I go to a hairdresser. We share the same hairdresser, and that she's booked all the way through the end of August. So, yeah,
you're gonna have a head of hair by then.
Absolutely, yeah. I'll be very shaggy.
Yeah.
So, John, it's my pleasure this evening to introduce Joe Reidy. We're going to be talking about Joe's most recent book, The Illusions of Emancipation. And as our viewers know, the University of North Carolina Press has been gracious enough to give our viewers a 40% discount, and there, in fact, is the discount code. I'll show this book a number of other times as well. This is a UNC book. It is published as part of the Littlefield series. The Littlefield series is actually done with UNC Press and the University of Texas. It is a series that's devoted to some of the big questions or topics in the American Civil War era. And the books are intended to offer new interpretations, which Joe has done for us, while also providing a synthesis of the field. So, hard to imagine a topic from the Civil War era that has more relevance to what we are seeing across the country in the last 2.5 to 3 weeks. And before I start asking Joe some questions here, I do want to note that at different points in our conversation, that will certainly offer some reflections on the ways that we understand emancipation and how that can or could inform our thinking about current events. Joe Reidy is a distinguished scholar. He's Professor Emeritus from Howard University in Washington, D.C. Of course, many of our viewers have some familiarity with the institution. Certainly, some know the institution was named after, of course, the Union General O.O. Howard. Joe, again, has spent much of his career there, but he also spent a significant amount of time contributing as an editor to the Freedom Project. The Freedom Project, as we've talked about on this show before, is 4 volumes. Is that correct, Joe?
Actually, it's 6 now.
6 now.
And growing.
And growing. 6 volumes. I have the Black Military Experience. That's the volume that I'm holding now. And again, Joe can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but the documents in the Freedom series are almost entirely from the National Archives. Is that correct?
Correct.
That's right. Correct. And for those of our loyal followers, they know from Jim Downs, who spoke about this series. They talked about the documents that are from the Freedmen's Bureau. Jim did a fantastic piece about how we might think about and interpret the documents in this series. And as we talked about with Jim, and we'll talk about this evening as well, historians for so long were frustrated because they believed they couldn't really hear the voice of enslaved people, especially during that transition when they became free people. Thanks to this absolutely path-breaking, essential series on emancipation and Reconstruction, we now have ample sources that come directly from freed people. I should also note, I gotta look at my notes here, 1994, Joe and his co-editors received the very distinguished prize, the Lincoln Prize, co-sponsored by Gilder and Lehrman Institute and Gettysburg College. So another congratulations for receiving that distinguished award.
Thank you.
I want to note before I again ask Joe his first question, I should have mentioned about Illusions of Emancipation. It has received a prize, a coveted prize in the historical profession, and that's the Bancroft Prize. So you still must be glowing from that, right, Joe?
Absolutely. I will be forever.
Absolutely. You should have Maybe they haven't given you the plaque yet. That should be right behind you on the wall.
Okay, thank you.
So, Joe, I was reading the acknowledgments of Illusions of Emancipation. And in the acknowledgments, you said, this book, it was something you thought about doing. You started, and then you went over to the project, working on these documents. And so you had a little bit of a hiatus. And maybe it was a hiatus of how many years? 10 years plus?
Yeah, quite a while.
Yeah. But, as you're delving deep into all these incredible primary sources that have been really kind of untapped, can you help us understand that? How did your time with the project, how did that start to shape your thinking, shape the questions that got you going on what became Illusions of Emancipation?
All right, thank you, Pete. I'll be happy to answer that question. And let me thank you and John again for your very gracious invitation for me to share some time with you and your friends this evening. It's been a long time in the making, as you suggested, and it began out of this notion that the Civil War meant a tremendous amount to African American people as well as to all Americans in ways that we probably didn't understand. So there was still quite a bit of, shall we say, popular understanding in the 1970s, the time when all of this stuff began to brew in my mind. And when I began to work with Ira Berlin and Leslie Rowland on the Freedom Project, that emancipation was a kind of an event, and many people associated it with Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. And those who didn't associate it necessarily with the proclamation might have associated it with the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which, as we know, outlawed slavery. So there was an understanding of emancipation as either a static process that was punctuated by certain events, often authored by great men, either Abraham Lincoln himself or by the Congress that ultimately drafted the 13th Amendment, and that it proceeded in a kind of a linear fashion. So part of the work that we undertook with the Freedmen and Southern Society Project was just to dig into that, and especially to take advantage of what we knew to be the vast storehouse of untapped primary source material that was at the National Archives. You mentioned the Freedmen's Bureau papers, and that's obviously a starting point for anybody who's interested in this topic. But as it turns out, the military records of the United States Army commands during the Civil War also contain tremendous amounts of material relating to the experience of Black people, both enslaved and those who were becoming free and those who were free. And so we were able then to tap into that material. And in fact, with a sort of a sole focus on sources that were at the National Archives to retell the story of emancipation. So that's what we set out to do. And in the course of doing that, I think pretty early on, we succeeded in establishing a new way of looking at emancipation, one that wasn't rooted necessarily to these great events authored by singular political leaders, but it was more of a process. Yeah. And it was a process that included all kinds of contributors from all walks of life. And obviously, African Americans played an important role in that, both as enslaved people trying to become free and free Black people in the North, many of whom, of course, volunteered once the United States Army opened its ranks to African Americans. But in addition to that, we saw wonderful evidence of the way that soldiers in the Union Army from all different backgrounds and all different regions of the northern states, and even those southern states that had Union Army forces recruited there, they had a role in emancipation that was previously underappreciated. So in a sense, we were trying to do a people's history of how slavery came to an end. So that's the backdrop of how the work of the project then began to broaden even, the view that I took about what emancipation was all about, to make it much more comprehensive, much more inclusive, much more finely layered, with people from enslaved Southerners, through white Northern soldiers recruited in, say, the upper Midwest or New England, through the commanders of Union Army regiments, up through the politicians and the president who we normally associate with emancipation.
Right. It's hard to imagine what a typical day at the project must have been, and how hard it must have been to like actually get anything done, because you find this document, you're probably so excited, and hey, wait, there's Barbara Fields. Barbara, I got to read this to you, and then no, I need to read this to you. So, what was that like? Were you all just sort of just buzzing with energy all the time because you're discovering all these incredible gems, right?
Right. So there was that phase of it when we were doing the research at the National Archives. Now, this was at a time when we were permitted to have access to the shelves, so we could get into the stacks of the National Archives.
Wow.
And all of that came to an end by the late 1970s. But in any case, we got 2 or 3 years of good research in at the National Archives in the shelves. And we had as our guide the marvelous and still not fully appreciated Dr. Sarah Dunlap Jackson, who was an archivist who worked in the old military records. Now, this was a woman who graduated from South Carolina State University in 1942, I think. And she decided to come to Washington to work for the national government. And she was hired at the National Archives. Now, at that time, the classification system required that African American employees at the National Archives be classified essentially as custodial workers.
Jesus.
But Sarah Jackson, over the years, managed to learn about the records. And despite the fact she was working in them at this very lowly classification, she made it her business to understand everything there could be understood about the Freedmen's Bureau records and about the Civil War military records, especially as it pertained to Black folk and to emancipation. So essentially, she guided us to where the best holdings were. And of course, in the end, we ended up going through everything very systematically. And you can imagine, given the fact that the federal government saved everything from the Civil War era, the records we were going through were littered with all kinds of things that you would consider totally irrelevant. So requisitions for hay and replacement wagon wheels and whatnot made up a considerable bulk of the military records that we were looking at. But then we would come upon the gems that you described, Pete, and we had to stop everything else we were doing. And we would have readings out loud of these marvelous documents. Now, in some cases, we would then inform Dr. Jackson that, oh, we had found this wonderful letter. And she said, oh, I knew about that from years ago. I had seen that. Oh, and by the way, did you see these other letters that are related to that? So she would take us then on a further expedition to link some of these marvelous records with other ones that would help to put them into context. But you're right, we literally stopped the work when we found the gems, as we would call them, and we would do public readings of them, and then we would marvel at them, and then try to figure out everything that was there, try to unpack them.
How exciting. Did Dr. Jackson get to see the publication of any of these volumes?
Yes, she did. In fact, we dedicated the Black military experience to her. And so she got to see that one published. And I don't think she got to see the second one published, which was The Destruction of Slavery.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
It is.
Right. So we owe such an incredible debt to her. In fact, everybody who works in this field, and perhaps they're not aware of it, but she is, in effect, the godmother of all of this work.
Yeah. Well, that's an incredible story. I hope somebody is able to write something, and maybe somebody already has, about her career, because it's so important. I'd love to have someone, maybe even you, come to CWI and speak about her life, right?
Sure.
And I think a lot of people who read what we produce,
right,
there's no reason why they would have any sense as to how indispensable archivists are. And what we do, and for what Dr. Jackson was able to do, and what she was against. Right? I hope the National Archives today as in planning, thinking about doing something, right, to acknowledge her contributions to the field, and maybe they are.
They are aware of it. So
Yeah.
the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, in fact, is what agency within the archives she was working for when we were doing that work. So that they recall her memory very vividly with the age.
I don't know if you know Trevor Plant. Trevor Plant's at the National Archives and works, and I don't want to give his title because I'll probably give the wrong title, but he, in essence, overseeing a lot of the military history records. And he, in fact, we were going to invite him to come to CWI to speak about the gems of the National Archives. And I'm going to ask him if he's familiar. I'm sure he must be familiar with Dr. Jackson's work, to say something about her, because this is, what a tribute to a career, right? It's really quite remarkable.
Right.
Joe, John has a very famous woodcut from Harper's Weekly that's in your book as well. And I'd like to show it. And here's my question for you, Joe. I show this to my students, right? And Joe, I'm just going to say, this is kind of what I tell my students, and I'd like for you, in all seriousness, critique what I say, and how does that give us some insights also into your broad thinking about emancipation? So what I tell my students is, if you want to understand the revolutionary change that the war wrought, here it is, right? Here it is, where we see an enslaved man in rags, right? And then we see that when his coat and shirt are taken off, the physical whipping that he was subjected to, right? You can see the pain, the torture, the violence, right? It is part of his body, the disposability of Black bodies. There it is. And then redemption. And it happens what? It happens in, it seems, in an instant, right? As soon as that man puts a blue suit on, that man is now a fighter for freedom, and he is a man who is recognized as, in essence, a citizen of the United States. So, how is that assessment? Does that need some tweaking, some refinement in light of your findings of your book?
All right, let me refine it a little bit. I think the overall take that you have just described on these images is correct. And the fact that they are preserved as images, I think, illustrates how poignant that transition was and how quick it could have appeared to occur, even to people at the time. So this was a standard theme, and photography was, 10 years old at the time of the Civil War. And so actually the image in the center there are photographic images of his back that, if anything, are more vivid than this one from the woodcut. But the point that I'm making is people understood that photographs could tell a story, and they told stories very deliberately. And so one of the themes was this rapid transformation from slavery to freedom. And in this case, from a man who had been brutalized in slavery to a proud soldier of the United States Army. So that was a reality. And the men who escaped from slavery and took on the uniform of the United States, they felt it within them. They communicated it. They communicated it to their families. They communicated it to their officers. They communicated it to Confederates when they had the opportunity to do that they were men. They had been treated as property, whipped and abused worse than dogs, but now they were men. But here's where I would qualify it. See, part of what I was suggesting about looking at emancipation as an event was a supposition that it moved in a single direction, that it moved from slavery to freedom. And you could say that it took 4 years for that movement to occur, but in some respects, 4 years is a short amount of time. I mean, after all, look at the contemporary wars in which the United States has been engaged, right? Much, much longer than 4 years. So 4 years was a quick amount of time. But if we assume that the direction was only from slave to free man, from a man in tatters to a man in the United States Army, then we mixed some of the complexity of it. The process was not linear. At times it was circular. It could feed back on itself. So, for example, at times when Union forces occupied Confederate territory, people in that territory would become free, especially after the Emancipation Proclamation, because the United States Army declared them free. But if the Army then had to retreat from that territory, quite often they would leave those so-called freed people behind. And then often Confederate forces would pounce upon them and re-enslave them. And in fact, there's another companion photograph of a before and after escaped slave to soldier, one that in fact I include in the book. It's a man called Hubbard Pryor, who was from Georgia, who escaped to Tennessee. And they took identical photos to those of Gordon, the before picture with him sitting on a stool, covered in rags, having just escaped from slavery, to afterward, proudly standing in the uniform of a United States Army man, right? Yeah. So he makes his escape in 1864, but unfortunately he found himself among a regiment of African-American soldiers whose position was overrun and captured by Confederates. So he, like many of the other men in his regiment then, were captured by the Confederate armed forces. And in effect, they were returned to slavery after that. So I make the point in the book that even though it appears that revolutions move forward in a positive direction, from slavery to freedom, and from rags to the proud uniform of a United States soldier, revolutions could also go backward. And this was terminology that people during the Civil War were also playing around with, often by way of saying revolutions don't go backward. Once set in motion, they continue on a forward trajectory. But what I'd like to suggest is that the before and after image is good for certain purposes to show the contrast between what enslaved people might have endured and what freedom represented. But in reality, it was much more complicated, and the revolution could go backward, and the proud soldier could be re-enslaved. He could be assassinated, for that matter, having fallen into Confederate hands.
Joe, I hope at the end we come back to this triumphant narrative of emancipation and how you fit within this growing school that certainly is raising some questions about that and wants to make it a little bit more complex.
Right.
But before I turn over to John real quickly for a first question, John, do you mind showing the past, the woodcut that you showed?
Yeah, I'll put it back up for you.
Yeah, that'd be great.
It's fine.
And so, Joe, this may be our first opportunity here. And, you know, as I've said, I think to the audiences here before, it is always, I think, a risk when we as historians look to the future. We're trying to look to the past, right?
Right.
And I think that one of those challenges that I've talked about with John on this show is the use of the word white supremacy is almost a timeless explanation. And that while I'm not denying the presence and the power of racism, my point that as historians, our great, I think, one of our great contributions we offer is that we can appreciate the importance of context, being time specific. When you start to seek timeless explanations, I think we get away from what is our high ground, so to speak. Now, with that said, as a caveat of sorts, you know, there is this history, long history, in which Black bodies are treated as if they're just purely disposable, to be used and then to be disposed with. And so, again, be brutally honest here, Joe. When we look at something like this, is there anything in this image, is there anything in this particular story in which to give us some insights to help us understand some of the challenges is an understatement, but the challenges that poor, and I want to stress that, poor African Americans confront in the United States today?
All right, I'll take an approach to it that comes out of that photograph.
Sure.
I think white supremacy always has to be put into a context of when and where and what were the institutional relationships among people living within the United States, some of whom were citizens, some of whom were not, some of whom were of European ancestry, some of whom were of African ancestry and Native American ancestry. And those institutional contexts help to explain a lot. So without going into too much detail about how institutional change over the course of the Civil War affects what we see today,
Right.
suffice it to say that the institution of slavery permitted persons of European ancestry to flog people like Gordon to the point where his back looked like it was tatters, and then it healed that way. People of European ancestry could well have killed Gordon and not have been held accountable for that, because the institution of slavery permitted that type of cruelty, in fact, arguably encouraged that type of cruelty. So that's a very particular context for understanding how his back got to be the way it is.
Right.
Now, when the Civil War enables other institutions to come onto the scene that permitted this kind of violence, like the United States Army, for example, then Gordon can shed the tattered garment of a slave and take on the uniform of a United States soldier. Not only does he become free, but he lays a claim to citizenship in the United States of America. So, as you know, the last section of the book, and the illusions of emancipation, I addressed various ways that people use the concept of home during the Civil War period, and especially in connection with emancipation. So African American, enslaved African Americans were looking for new definitions of home. And as part of that, new institutional context that did not permit European Americans to inflict that kind of pain and suffering on persons of African ancestry. So finding a home independent from a slave master, finding a free home in the southern states as well as in the northern states was a critical component of that. Situating these homes where African American parents were presiders over their own household, not answerable to a master in how they raised their children, could fit into communities. And those communities in turn could fit into the United States of America. That's where Gordon the soldier played a critical role, as did the 180,000 other black men who served in the United States Army and the 20,000 or so who served in the United States Navy. They laid a claim to citizenship, which put them then into a totally different institutional context than the context of slavery. In fact, they were working, fighting, dying to destroy the institution of slavery. And once that institution was destroyed, then there became an opportunity for different institutions to take that place, to take the place of slavery. And so then as we talk about the growth of free labor, the growth of political parties in the South, especially during Reconstruction, in which African Americans were critically important participants as voters, as workers, as members of communities, as people who built churches and built schools and taught their children citizenship, taught their children how to worship God and so on, then there's a different set of institutions that apply. So if you want to then talk about white supremacy in that context, the picture looks very different from the way that it does during slavery.
So,
now, without taking too many quick steps to the present,
right.
The institutions that represented freedom during Reconstruction, of course, didn't last in many respects past the 1870s, at least the political institutions. So Reconstruction was overturned, and by the end of the 19th century, a whole different regime was in place that ensconced white supremacy in the form of discriminatory laws, in terms of disfranchisement, in terms that we generally describe as Jim Crow. And that's a different context also from Reconstruction. So over the span of about 50 years, there are three radically different institutional frameworks in which to understand how Gordon and other men like him and their families would have experienced white supremacy.
Joe, that's very well said. It's clear, it's precise, it's complicated, and your emphasis on institutions and how those institutions changed and how African Americans were a big part, at least, of the destruction of slavery. Joe, I just want to press just a little bit, just maybe help us and your audiences. And I know this is taking away from the topic of your book, but you're speaking of institutions, and I keep saying, you know what, people continue to see Black bodies as something to be used and be disposable. Mm-hmm. Do you have any sense of how we can think about institutions? And I'll just throw something out quickly. Right? You spoke of slavery and the destruction of slavery and how that created a moment or an opportunity for African Americans to have control over their households or their homes, as well as their communities in ways that they hadn't before. Now, today, how do we think about the institutions that are impinging upon African American lives, constraining their lives, denying them opportunities? Right? What are the institutions out there, Joe, that rather than saying white supremacy, which clearly you say, okay, fine, but you got to root it within the institutions, what would you say about today, if you feel comfortable going down that road?
Well, I'll go a little bit down that route, and then you can either halt me or kind of point it in a different direction. But I think the institutional contexts are critically important. And I say this in part because the institutional landscape is very complex. So if, for example, we look at American cities today in the early 21st century, and after all, this is where a sizable proportion of the African American population resides. And now, as we know from COVID, with respect to the impact that it's having on the Latino communities, large Latino communities reside in cities and in nearby suburbs. So there's an entire institutional framework there that reflects the legacy of inequality that grew out of slavery and that was attempted to be addressed to some extent during Reconstruction, but then was shut down during the period of so-called redemption and then Jim Crow. So there's a long period in which inequality in every respect, in economic inequality, social inequality, and the power that's associated with that, and political inequality, were supported by institutions throughout the United States. And so if nothing else, there's the lingering effect of that. And let's not forget, it's only during the 1960s that the federal government began to take action to address some of those inequalities and to make federal institutions more responsive to the present, much less the influence of African Americans. Now, more recently, African Americans, of course, have come to exert some influence over institutions outside of their own communities. So obviously, the matter of internal community institutions, such as associations of one kind or another, clubs, and voluntary associations, that legacy has been unbroken from the slavery period right down to the present. Right. But the ability of African Americans to affect political institutions, even with cities with majority Black populations, we know has been limited, in part because the vote doesn't necessarily entitle the result that would, in effect, serve those communities without the input of other constituencies. And this could either be other white citizens in a city, it could be lobbyists of one kind or another who obviously influence legislation and the exertion of power. So institutions don't function simply as a reflection of those who participate in them. So it's complicated in that sense. And so African Americans vote in the cities where the police are now brutalizing them. So they have some influence over the political institutions in those cities, but they don't have the ability, at least not alone, to begin to affect the use of police power. Now, that may be changing, and what we're seeing, I think, today is suggestive that it is changing. But that, too, I think, helps us to understand lessons that we can help to understand this recent phenomenon from lessons that came out of emancipation during the Civil War. So even leaving aside the history of the abolitionist movement that, of course, long predated the Civil War, the fact that African American and European Americans from the northern states combined together to use their forces to defeat the Confederacy and to overturn slavery, I think is a very important lesson for us to keep in mind. By themselves, enslaved African Americans, I don't think could have overturned slavery. But as part of an institution, namely the government of the United States, the armed forces of which were committed to destroying slavery, that was the outcome. So I think that's a lesson. So people can come together around important civic issues that cannot be, in effect, solved by segments of the population, but by unified movements across the various differences: geographic, nationality, race, income, and marvelous things can happen.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. It has been, to see, at least from my perspective, a democracy that was kind of in lethargy for so long, and these last few weeks, even if one has some misgivings about aspects of these social protest movements, I think one could probably put those misgivings aside and find a degree of reassurance of seeing people, again, like you said, various backgrounds coming together and demanding for social change. So good. That was, Joe, that was extraordinarily insightful and I think very valuable for people to hear.
I don't want to romanticize this either, Pete. So it's not just a matter of, everybody joining hands and singing Kumbaya and all of that, as we know, because the opposition against such movements has always been strong.
Yes.
And at bottom, addressing the matter of police brutality has to be part of a bigger picture of addressing the incredibly disruptive inequalities that exist in various segments of the population. And until that is addressed, and issues such as police brutality will keep recurring.
I've always been surprised, Joe, that much of this has not been rooted within deindustrialization of the 1970s and 1980s and 1980s. I'm shocked how that does not enter really the discourse, whether it be the press or whether it even be in Black Lives Matter. I mean, we're incarcerating young Black men for a drug culture that is, for them, the only really reasonable or sort of economic option or possibility. And it's because, of course, the economic foundations of those cities, they have been destroyed. And I'm shocked still that corporate America, that there have not been demands placed upon them. So but who knows? As we all know, protest movements.
And here too, I think, Pete, the example of Martin Luther King Jr.'s career makes this vividly clear. So by the time of his assassination, he was committed to economic change in the United States. And in fact, the Poor People's Movement that indeed survived his assassination was getting to where he viewed the future of the movement in the United States for meaningful social change.
Absolutely.
Certainly access to voting rights and to more broadly civil rights was critically important, but without addressing economic inequality, then the other pieces would be subject to change and negative change, backward change.
Thomas Jackson wrote a very good book about Dr. King and his move toward what you had just described, a move toward demands for economic justice and social justice.
And Michael Rennie also did a recent one too.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I can't remember the title of Tom's book, but Thomas Jackson, like the general, I guess. I did that as well. All right, John, I'll now have to put you in the enviable position to reel me back in. I think, again, these questions are so valuable that we just have to do it. Let's try to get back here to Joe's book if we can.
Well, you're absolutely right. Those questions are valuable, and we as historians have to provide context and allow ourselves to do that, and also to listen to others who are more knowledgeable than we are in this, such as Joe is with Emancipation, and we also want to give a huge shout out to the archivists who make us who we are, apparently, and I'm always they don't get enough credit. So I want to give a lot of credit to the archivists out there and people who digitize these documents for us. It's a fantastic thing to be able to utilize them for great things. And I would like to ask Professor Reidy about time. And we've gone over this just touched on it just a little bit. And I think we need to, as Pete says, reel ourselves back into your monograph here just for a little bit. Okay. I'm guilty, as I was reading through your book, I'm guilty of being the historian who puts things in chronological order. And I'd say, okay, like the Gordon woodcut, right. Enslaved person, and then soldier, and then I know it's not the finished portion of that story, but you tend to put in a chronological phase. Right. You talk about seasons of change. Right. And seasons of liberation or a season of destruction. Right. Could you talk about that a bit for our viewers who will be reading through your book, what you mean by it?
Okay. I'll be happy to do that, John. Thank you. Mm-hmm. So what I tried to do was deliberately to kind of swim upstream against the notion of linear time. So I assume that most people believe, let me just put it that way, in linear time. We're born, we live, and then we're not living anymore, right? So things have a beginning and they have an end. If we can believe the physicists, then the universe had a beginning and perhaps someday it will have an end. So we tend to think along those sort of lines. Mm-hmm. But we also think in terms of cyclical time. So the seasons of the year, for example. So we're about to celebrate the longest day of the year in a couple of days. And what happens after that? The days get shorter until mid-December when it's dark at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And then they get longer again until it's light out at 9 or 10 o'clock in the evening in the summertime. Mm-hmm. So within us, in fact, within all living organisms, there is also a notion of cyclical time. And much of it is tied into the seasons, but not all of it. But metaphorically, a lot of it is. We talk about the autumn of despair, the winter of death, the springtime of hope, and all of those kind of things. So even our language reflects this notion of seasonal time. So what I was trying to do then in terms of providing alternatives to the linear time was to figure out how seasons factored into emancipation. And to take only one example, obviously Civil War armies had campaign seasons, at least in the upper South, perhaps not so much in the deep South where the winters were not so bracing, shall we say. So they took a few months off, and as we know, the soldiers built themselves comfortable wooden cabins. They had fireplaces in them and all of that, and they knew they were in the winter season. And this was not so much a matter of taking time off, as we know. It's simply a matter of armies couldn't move on unpaved roads during the winter season of the year. The combinations of rain and ice and frost and snow and all of that simply made it impossible. So a campaign season typically launched in late January, maybe mid-February, sometime in that timeline, and then troops began to move in earnest in March and April. So from the standpoint of African Americans who wanted to become free, if their dream of becoming free depended on gaining access to physical United States Army soldiers within striking distance of where they lived or where they thought they could get in real time, winter time was not the time to be thinking about escaping. Wait until the springtime. At least then you knew that the armies would be approaching and there might be a chance of getting some protection there by making it to Union Army lines. Mm-hmm. Now, the more sophisticated of those African American enslaved men and women who had in fact escaped, if perhaps even for a period of time while they were being held as slaves, also understood that spring wasn't the best time necessarily. Surely the soldiers might have been there, but how were you going to feed yourself on the lam, essentially, when the little sprouts of green were just coming out of the ground? It would be far better to wait until the late summer months, August and September and October, when edible crops were at their peak, literally waiting harvest. And that might provide an opportunity whereby somebody who was escaping slavery and had to feed themselves on the run had a reasonable chance of finding edibles that would carry them through long enough to reach the Union position. So when we start to think about this process of emancipation as tied into such changing of the seasons and what it meant then in terms of passability of roads, inclement weather, availability of food from the wild, then it takes on a picture that we wouldn't get at all from a static view that the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves, just to take one easy punching target for me to wail at. Mm-hmm. There's much more complexity and subtlety built into it, and there is that seasonal component to it.
Mm-hmm. Joe, do you think there's a different way we should think about or interpret the time from the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation following the Battle of Antietam in November 62 to when it is the official proclamation on January 1st, 1863? Did you kind of just, how should we understand or interpret the document and its evolution between those two periods?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. There were many contemporaries of Lincoln who would have bet a large amount of money and perhaps a large quantity of property that he might not issue the final proclamation. So there was an element of uncertainty. Were U.S. Army forces going to be so successful over the 3 months of the fall of 1862 that Lincoln might say, all right, it's a dead letter. We don't need to do this because we've got the upper hand militarily. Right. Or was he going to strike a political deal with the border states and perhaps even with people in the upper South region in Tennessee, for example, that might be willing to come back into the United States and in effect set in motion a house of cards that could see the Confederacy collapsing without Lincoln actually promulgating the final proclamation on the 1st of January. So African American and enslaved African Americans in the southern states, they knew what was going on because word traveled, obviously, in part from what they were overhearing their masters talking and worrying about. But they were very much aware that things could take a different turn in January of 1863. Now, of course, as we know, Lincoln didn't step back from it. He issued the proclamation on January 1st, 1863, even though he did exempt forest areas within the South that created some complications that not everybody at the time was fully comfortable with. But I think the other part about it, too, and some recent historical studies have suggested the importance of looking at Lincoln's commitment to slavery as falling much earlier than even the preliminary emancipation. His commitment to emancipation, that is, arising much earlier than the late summer of 1862 when he issued the preliminary proclamation, or January 1st, 63 when he issued the final one. And I think it's important for us to realize that there was a supposition on the part of certainly a large segment of Republicans, including Republican office holders, that the war did require a frontal assault against slavery. And then one thing, of course, that Lincoln's proclamation did was make that official United States policy, so that the armed forces of the United States then had to take efforts to destroy slavery and not simply to defeat the Confederacy by defeating Confederate armies.
Do you, I'm just curious where you sort of fall in the scheme of historical thought about Lincoln and emancipation. I mean, you make it very clear in your book that to see Lincoln as a great emancipator, that he is the one that is responsible solely for the freeing of the slaves, as a very outdated white understanding of emancipation. And if you push that aside, but so how should we, or how do you feel about Lincoln? Did he play it too politically? Was he too conservative? Was he not really transparent enough about this? I mean, what's your final judgment?
Well, my final judgment is that I think his heart was always in the right place. His actions often betrayed that. And his heart was not always beating in the same pulse rate, shall we say, with that of enslaved African Americans or free African Americans. And what I mean by saying that his heart was in the right place, he hoped that slavery would come to an end. But the timeline on which he saw it realistically coming to an end was not one that envisioned quick action and quick and decisive action. He was content, as he kept saying, to have a peaceful resolution of the issue of slavery that, in fact, might have included African Americans remaining enslaved down to the start of the 20th century, down to 1900. So he was still trying to play that card as a way of placating Southern slaveholders to, in effect, put down their arms and cease rebelling against the authority of the United States. So I think that's part of the uncertainty that's also at play between Antietam and the announcement of the preliminary proclamation and then the final proclamation. What, in effect, would he say to try to bring slavery to an end short of its final destruction in real time? So from that standpoint, he was being very political, and I don't necessarily fault him for that. I mean, after all, he was trying to wage peace, in effect. He wanted to bring the war to an end as quickly as he could, but on terms that would be acceptable. That is to say, with the Confederacy agreeing to the authority of the United States government and with the Confederacy abandoning slavery. But as he said often, disingenuously, if he could have done that, freeing all the slaves or none of the slaves or some of the slaves, he would have done that. And I think he spoke from his heart when he said that. But after all, I do give him credit, though, for staying the course. He pursued the defeat of the Confederacy, even as he said in the second inaugural address, with all the bloodshed that it meant, and with recognizing that slavery, in fact, exacted a burden of guilt on the entire nation, on the slaveholding states. And he also favored, of course, as you know, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which was enacted after he was assassinated. But he understood the importance of making that part of the central law of the land and not having it subject to any type of question as a military measure that he did as the commander-in-chief in order to achieve victory in the Civil War.
Quick question, and then we'll turn to John, see if we have any other questions from our audience. You mentioned the second inaugural, and in which Lincoln, who, countless books written about Lincoln's religious beliefs, if he had really any at all. Was he an atheist? Was he deist? I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. What I'd like for you to reflect upon, though, is how enslaved people, as they are trying to make sense of this great cataclysm, the Civil War, trying to understand who's directing these events, even though they know that they have their own part, their own power. Could you help us, because I really like this part of the book, deal with, and this again is a monolithic statement that is incorrect, but Black spirituality, which of course its expressions were incredibly varied. But I'm really interested in how did religious beliefs serve in a sense as an anchor? How did it serve as a prism as Black folks were navigating this moment?
Right. So in the book, I tried to draw heavily from the African Methodist Episcopal Journal, the Christian Recorder. And I take that as a kind of looking at it from issue to issue over the course of the war. It provides a running commentary on what the mainstream press in the large urban areas, the New York press, the Washington press in particular, are narrating as the course of the war. So the Christian Recorder is doing two things. Number one, it's providing this sort of running commentary, but it's focusing in two ways that are different from what the mainstream press is doing. Largely the contributors who are writing letters to the Christian Recorder and the editors who are writing the editorial commentary are looking at how the conflict is bearing on slavery. first and foremost, and then on the long-term place of African Americans in the United States of America. And second of all, again, this is the African Methodist Episcopal Church's official organ. They're looking at how the lessons that they're seeing playing out in the course of the war are affirming their religious beliefs, especially on the role of a higher power in the affairs of human beings.
Right.
And so much of their commentary is filtered through that prism as well, not just the anti-slavery, pro-citizenship prism, which has secular roots as well as religious roots, but also through the prism, if I could say it, of salvation history.
Right.
So they're looking at Old Testament lessons about the chosen people, leading to the promised land, and they see their people, African Americans, in much a similar fashion. So much of the commentary then about the unfolding events is comparing that to the salvation history and to the Old Testament lessons of movement from slavery to the promised land. And it's remarkable. And so I try to quote liberally from both the letter writers and the commentators to get a sense of how they're viewing this. And obviously it has downs as well as ups. So to talk about the seasonal influence of this, or the cyclical, as I mentioned earlier, there are times when many of the commentators, both letter writers and editorial writers, are almost despondent with how dismal the situation looks. At the same time, not giving up trust that the God of the universe that they know and that they love and that they worship is not going to lead his people to the promised land. So there's a cyclical tone in all of that as well. But it's just it's a marvelous commentary on what the mainstream press, or what the, shall we say, the sort of linear understanding of how emancipation unfolds really sizes it up.
John, do you have any questions for us here?
I have a question about the idea of new social relationships as we move into our own kind of way of dealing with that today. But as far as back then, in the mid-19th century, with the ending of the war and then a mass emigration of formerly enslaved people, now free people, to new parts of the country, including parts of the North, you get into the idea of the struggle for equality, even in the North, obviously. I'm stuck on this seasonal thing because this has really piqued my interest. You know, I learned something new with that, and I'm like, okay, I gotta really run with this. As we go past the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, we go into Reconstruction. How is this emigration and learning these new social norms, how is that impacting not only the people involved in it, but the politics of the area? And and I know it varies. I understand that. But as far as this new social norm taking hold, we see Reconstruction as, a lot of us see it as a failure. And when you really dive into it, and we see different ways of looking at Reconstruction, as far as Reconstruction 2.0, kind of like in the 1960s, is this Reconstruction 3.0 today? What about that seasonal change involved with the mass emigration, as we had talked to previously with Jim Downs, and moving forward with that after let's say the 15th Amendment into Reconstruction?
Well, I think there are a couple of pieces to this. I think the mass movement occurs later. So there is some movement of freed African Americans out of the southern former slave states to the north, but it's nowhere near in numbers or proportions as it is in the 20th century, around World War I and World War II in particular, the so-called Great Migration. Mm-hmm. There is quite a bit of movement within the South, though. So remember, there's not a unified national labor market until the 20th century. So African Americans as free people were essentially agricultural workers. So for them, opportunity often meant moving to the Southwest, to Arkansas or to Texas, and many of them did, even from 1865 and 1866. And some of this, in fact, was done under the auspices of the Freedmen's Bureau, who was trying to help communities of African Americans to find work And if work was not going to be abundant enough in the area in which they had been enslaved, then there was some effort to help them move elsewhere. There was also quite a bit of movement from rural areas to cities. So southern cities, black populations grew tremendously. In fact, much of that growth occurred during the war itself and continued afterwards. So again, the seasonality there is going to affect what kind of work they would be able to find. Obviously, people working in an agricultural setting would be used to the cyclical effect of all of that. But the critical piece of where the seasonality affected the larger life, the political life in particular, during Reconstruction, has to do precisely with the grant of the suffrage to African American men, which, as you know, comes in 1867 with the Reconstruction Acts that set up military government in the former Confederate states that had not been readmitted to the United States. So African American men begin participating. And I mean, the voting turnouts during Reconstruction, as I'm sure you know, especially during the early years, were 90% plus of the African American male population that was eligible to vote. They voted. And they often voted, in effect, with their wives and families supporting them to back the Republican ticket, to back the radical ticket. And so there's a tremendous amount of excitement about everything having to do with participating in the political life of the community. Then, of course, first with the Ku Klux Klan, and then later with various schemes on the part of conservative whites, many of whom were wealthy former slaveholders and those who had made their wealth around the cotton plantation economy, especially in the Deep South states, began to devise ways to compromise that black political influence. And ultimately, as we know, without trying to skip over too much of that subtlety and too much of the detail, they did it through violence and intimidation. So by the early 1870s, the signs of that are pretty clear throughout the former Confederate states, that former slaveholders and their allies were using force to intimidate black men from exerting the right that had just been given to them. And so then, and at that time too, let's remember, down to 1870, Northern black men did not have the right to vote, except for 4 states in New England. So it's only with the 15th Amendment that in 1870 that African American men throughout the northern states gained the right to vote. It doesn't mean they were not political. So they had many causes they were advocating for, not the least of which, of course, were the black codes in places like Illinois and Ohio and the Midwestern states that restricted African American citizens in any number of ways. So there's political activity short of the suffrage. But go ahead.
So I just, again, I want to just go back just a little bit what you said about the participation of African American men who were eligible to vote and who did vote, and you said it was something like 95%. Could you just, again, I'm trying to see how you align that point among many others that you make with the title of your book, Illusions of Emancipation. So how do you square that for us?
Okay, so if we assume, the illusions, I'm using the word in multiple senses, of things that we think we know,
yes,
that really weren't,
right,
what shall we say, the reality on the ground.
yes.
But I also use it in the sense that many people alive at the Civil War used it, and that is to say aspirational. So part of the African American press for suffrage, and especially the right to vote, which of course began long before the start of the Civil War, was aspirational. They hoped to gain the vote so that they could then enjoy the full fruit of American citizenship and begin to influence the public life that affected their lives in many ways. So having the right to vote and participating in making laws and electing public officials, and maybe even serving as public officials, was aspirational for enslaved Southerners before the Civil War, and it became a reality almost overnight. Again, much like our friends Gordon and Hubbard Pryor, it became a reality overnight. So in 1867, they could exercise those rights, and they did it in the tremendous numbers that I suggested. And this is also at a time, as I suggested a minute ago, when black men in the northern states could not vote.
Mhm.
So they couldn't influence their governments and influence the passage of laws. They couldn't elect black men to public office in the northern states, yet formerly enslaved men could in the southern states. So for northern men, the vote was still aspirational, even as black southern men formerly enslaved gained the right to vote. So it wasn't such as such an illusion of emancipation, but it was sort of an aspirational promise of the end of slavery that still had not been realized. So then much of the political activity among free black northern men was to gain the right to vote, that their southern brothers, some of whom they had fought alongside with in regiments of the colored troops during the Civil War, had now achieved. Now, of course, with the end of Reconstruction, with the successful campaign of violence to stifle and confuse and otherwise disrupt African Americans as voters, then the aspirational pieces of the illusions of emancipation, I think, came back into play. So only a few years before, the men who were being intimidated from voting could vote. Now, it's not to say they weren't intimidated then. It's just that they had momentum on their side. There were federal troops in the former Confederate states in the early years of military Reconstruction that could help support the legitimate efforts on the part of African American men to vote. So that went away. So the aspiration of returning to those days would have affected these very same men by the middle of the 1870s. And of course, that aspiration remained that through the remainder of their lifetimes, no doubt, down into the 20th century.
Wonderful, wonderful. John, I don't know if you have any questions or from any of our viewers. I think we're starting to push our time a little bit here.
Yeah, we're pushing our time a little bit, and I apparently started a debate as it Reconstruction 3.0 today. So everyone's going, there's no questions. People are their own little chats in there, which is fantastic. So go ahead.
It is great. But let me just say one more thing about Joe's book, Illusions of Emancipation. Again, UNC Press. And I certainly think that if it's the one place you want to get introduced to this topic, this is the perfect starting point. In fact, the Littlefield series, which again, this is a part of, that was the very intent of the series. The intent was to have a volume that would be scholarly in its sort of orientation, certainly in its research, but its writing, which is beautiful. That's why Joe got the Bancroft Prize. The Bancroft Prize, right? If you write beautifully, and Joe does, that's why you get it. So this is a book that, again, is very accessible, but again, gets the complexities, which we've just heard. Joe is not quick to hard generalizations. He's always unpackaging the different layers of emancipation. And he has, we should note again, this remarkable career is still going on. I believe Joe is working right now on African-American sailors and identifying them. Is that correct?
Right.
He's doing that right now. And again, he's been part of the Freedom Project. I mean, again, this body of work that he keeps building upon has done so much to open up deep understandings of the lives of enslaved people as they went through the process. And that's the right word, right, Joe? The process of emancipation. I'm really eager to get you to CWI and to speak to our audiences up front and personal, so to speak, right? It'd be great to have you up here as well. And
it's my pleasure.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show. Congratulations again.
Thank you for hosting me. It's been a real fun experience. I've learned a lot too. So.
Man, I hope that our Facebook watchers, that they'll encourage their friends, even if they have no interest in slavery or emancipation. They need to listen to that 3 or 4 minutes in which you very carefully talked about the importance of institutions. And I think that that's so missing from our discourse today. We're so quick to throw out words that have such power and such force, but they don't quite get us to the complexities that you're pointing to. So you've done us all a great service, I think, this evening, not just in talking about the past, but you've given us a way to think about current events in a much more complex way. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for that. Pete, thank you for co-hosting as always. Thank you everyone for your comments. We didn't have many questions tonight. I don't think we had more than like 2, but you all are having a fantastic discussion in the comment section, which is what I love to see, and I know we as historians love to see good quality discussion about these topics.
And John, we should mention that we have on Monday Rachel Sheldon. Rachel is at Penn State University. She is a history of politics of the 1850s. We'll be talking about her book about the 1850s. We'll also be talking about her work at the Richards Civil War Center at Penn State. And so that's Monday at 7 o'clock.
There you go. That's going to be a great time. It's going to be the last week of Pete and I doing these together for a while. So that's going to be a sad time. He's going to miss me when I moved to Ontario.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'll be back for CWI. So hopefully I'll get to interview you, Joe, at the future CWI.
I look forward to it, John. Thank you.
Awesome. So thank you again, both of you guys, for being on. Thank you so much for doing this. This is fantastic. The discussion was great. Really appreciate that. Thank you for everyone in the comment section for the discussion. It's still going on, which is fantastic and very lively. So we will see you on Monday for our next presentation. Take care, everybody.
Okay. Thank you. Good night.